So I wanted to just say a few things about what's happening in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its war of aggression in Ukraine. Uh, Partly because I think it's the job of academics who study these things to try and contribute to our public understanding, even if that's just around the edges. And partly because I think some of the commentary is getting a few things wrong. So, three simple questions: what's happening? Why is it happening? And what should we do about it? Well, what's happening is one of the worst militarized crises and tragedies in Europe in the post war era. I think it's important to say that it's not the only emergency, as some are saying. There have been some very large scale and very dangerous moments before. For example, invasions or re-invasions of Czechoslovakia and Hungary, the Berlin crises, uh, Turkey into Cyprus, and of course the terrible bloodletting in Yugoslavia. And indeed, there is a danger in overstating the singularity of this event, and I'll come back to that. Nevertheless, this is a very dark turn in Europe's modern history. So why is it happening? I think the main change, I would say, that best answers the question, not just why, but why now, is that Russia recalculated its interests in the past year or so. In other words, Russia was determined to keep Ukraine out of what it sees as the Western orbit, the kind of EU, NATO, general Western sphere. It was doing so with more indirect methods, subversion, sponsoring proxy war, things like that. But it then recalculated in the belief that as things were going, the status quo before this war was becoming intolerable because Ukraine was gradually going further and further into the West's orbit. Not that Russia was necessarily frightened that Ukraine would join NATO formally, but that it would become an advanced base, an advanced hostile base, a potential platform for hostile forces, for advanced forces, for garrisons, even intermediate range missiles, etc. Of course, some would say that's an illegitimate thing to fear. Ukraine can do what it likes. Some would say that's an irrational fear, that Russia shouldn't have anything to be frightened of, whether it's because NATO is a defensive alliance, whether it's because it has a large nuclear arsenal already, whether it's because sovereign states are free to make their own foreign policy. A lot of these things are true, but it's still the brutal fact that Russia did fear this development and was concerned about the future. What clouds the issue further is that Russia, as Putin made very clear the other day, has nakedly imperial views of its neighbours, particularly Ukraine. Putin kind of enunciated a sort of czarist imperial dogma about the nations in Russia's near abroad. And so it's entirely possible that in a counterfactual universe where there had been no NATO expansion and no Western expansion and no EU enlargement, Russia, like a number of great powers in history, would have still predated on its neighbours. But while Putin's regime bears the primary responsibility, the sole moral responsibility for this war of aggression, I do think, and some will disagree with this, but I do think that the West inadvertently contributed to the underlying conditions which destabilised things, which led to this. Further, Russia, against some predictions, is willing to take a very large risk. And this is not necessarily because of Putin or because of Russia, but because of the tendencies of great powers. They historically, most of the time, dislike, resent, and fear encroachment by potentially hostile powers. And when in that state, they are usually willing to entertain doing very ruthless, brutal things. China was fearful of Western encroachment upon its borders, at its throat, as it were, on the Korean Peninsula in 1950. The United States feared dangerous encroachment in Cuba, Nicaragua, etc. And whilst we can debate day and night whether they should fear, the fact is they tend to fear. So the question then is what to do. The first thing is to think about the nature of the problem. Why do we care exactly beyond a natural human sympathy for the victims of this terrible event? And partly, I would say that actually the main referent object for us, the main thing to care about, is our security interests, beyond doing reasonable things to help the victims, generous aid to refugees, things like that. What does this threaten in our security interests in a world of scarce resources, the dangers of other powers with nuclear weapons with their own interests? How do we think carefully and prudently about what to do next? For my mind, the main question is, how does NATO best survive and strengthen its deterrence and strengthen its forces in the wake of Russia's aggression? And partly that's to do with doing what we can to ensure that if Russia does succeed in Ukraine, it's expensive, it's costly, so that it emerges from this campaign at least depleted, with its capacity to threaten others reduced, and then perhaps its appetite for further expansion also reduced. I don't actually think Vladimir Putin is a reincarnation of Adolf Hitler. I don't think he has the same level of recklessness and the same dreams of global conquest, but success can do strange things to predators, and should he succeed to some degree, we need to make sure that the next steps of aggression are unattractive and unfeasible. But that then dictates a number of difficult trade-offs, and part of the problem here is in all the clamour and outrage and kind of the projecting of Ukrainian colours onto the Brandenburg Gate and Number 10, some of the commentary is missing out on some hard trade-offs. So we can agree that there should be some sanctions, some economic warfare to have attritional effects. The harder question is how maximal those sanctions should be, how maximal should be the economic warfare. Because there's a big difference, I think, between trying to exhaust and deplete Russia and trying to cripple Russia. And what some hawks regard as truly serious sanctions would run a decent chance of doing that. But in doing so, trying to knock Russia out of the financial system, etc., that foreseeably would provoke Russia's retaliation. And it would get both sides into a economic cyber spiral that, even if it didn't erupt into a hot war, would leave us, in the end, the net effect would to leave us weaker. Not as weak as Russia, but weaker enough to rob us of opportunities to other things. And I think the other thing that we really need to think about and talk more about is, how does Europe itself, how does NATO Europe get serious about strengthening NATO's forces, strengthening NATO's eastern flank, strengthening NATO's nuclear and conventional deterrent? And that's not going to be done with small deployments here and there and with kind of well-intended statements and training missions, etc. It's going to cost some dollars, or should I say some pounds or some euros, and it's going to be some upfront costs. And so there does seem to be an uncomfortable link here between the size of the economic war we think we're going to get into and the resources we have at our disposal to do the most important thing, which is in fact not just to help Ukraine, but to help ourselves, to help NATO. And above all, to highlight the gap between what we won't fight for, which is Ukraine, and what we absolutely must and should and will fight for, which is NATO, all the way from the Baltic states. But that needs to be credible, that needs to be robust, and it needs to be larger. And I think at this point, politically, it's going to have to come primarily from Britain, France, and Poland as kind of leaders of this. There's two factors that condition this more on a more global scale. First of which is that the European NATO, and Britain as part of NATO, needs to absolutely be aware that the existing hegemon and security provider, the United States, can't keep picking up the bill forever as it has been doing. The systemic pressures on America to focus on the Indo-Pacific, to focus on containing China while doing other things, are going to be too strong. And if anything should wake us up from that to that reality, it's this crisis now. So the impetus has to come from European NATO. And whilst we might like to content ourselves that the effect of Putin's aggression is to stimulate this response, we still have to decide to be stimulated. That's a conscious choice, not just a thing that's going to somehow mechanically, automatically happen. The second worry I have, and this is more long-term, is that there's a big difference between a limited attritional campaign against Russia and an all-out spiral, because the latter has a bigger chance of driving Russia more into China's arms. The formation of a Russia-China axis, which I think is in fact already underway, but that could be accelerated and become irreversible, would be an extremely dangerous development for the West. It would be a very large kind of supersized adversary to take on, even if there wasn't a shooting war at all. That would stretch our resources, our domestic political consensus to the limit. It would create all sorts of further difficulties that might be avoidable, and it would raise the ultimate problem of potentially having to fight a war or a number of wars on two fronts, or some combination of China's direct aggression and Russia's increased interference in our domestic political affairs. So in other words, we have to go beyond denouncing what's happened. We have to go beyond just calling for maximal responses and get our teeth into the real hard trade-offs here. And above all, to recognize that if we're going to say seriously that history has returned, part of that is realizing that we have to take more of the future into our own hands. Some very lively minds will disagree with some or all of this. So this is just one contribution from the wings, and on a very bleak day in the world's history. Thanks very much.